Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Space Store Live. I'm Abby from Space Store, and tonight we have another episode of the Space Roundup with Nick and Terry. They'll be bringing you some of the most exciting space news stories from the last fortnight, as well as some things to look forward to in the night sky in the coming weeks. Thank you for taking your time out the Tuesday evening to spend with us, and for picking us over the football. And I'll now pass over to Nick and Terry for a great show.
Cheers,
Hi everybody.
Hi. Nice to see people in the chat already reminding us that we're up against the football and the SpaceX launch. So
no competition.
No competition, not at all. SpaceX, Pat. He can't even run Twitter, so let's not even go there. We've got another cracker tonight. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. And if you're not watching this live, hopefully you enjoy it on catch up. Because that seems to be the way that everyone, all the hip kids do it. We're having a chat before we went on air before about Facebook and Twitter and TikTok, and it's embarrassing. Like people of our generation, Terry, I guess, we're still stuck a little bit on Facebook and Twitter, but it's social media is having a bit of a change around at the moment. So who knows what's going to be happening over the coming months? But we have got a cracking. Oh, go on, sorry, Terry.
Yeah. I was just going to say I'm still stuck in carrier pigeons.
2 cans, piece of string. That's all you need. All you need. So we finally, Terry's going to lead on this one, we finally got to see something substantial launch from Pad 39B, didn't we, Terry?
Indeed, yes. Not a lot of people know this, but there's a Smartie around the moon. You know, those little coloured sweets with, they come in a little tube or a little packet. How come? Because Smartie is an anagram of Artemis. Not a lot of people know that. Yes, at last we got the launch, and boy, what a launch that was. as the Americans like to say, 8.8 million pounds of thrust, or in more conventional units, 3,929, the most powerful rocket ever, not quite as tall as the Saturn V, but more powerful. So powerful, in fact, that the blast blew the doors off the elevators at the launch pad, so they'll have to redesign those. Yeah, after many delays for all sorts of reasons, which we've covered before, finally got it off on November the 16th. And it's actually at the moon now. It did roughly a full orbit of the Earth, then fired the rocket again for what's called a translunar injection, which is the terminology they used way back in the Apollo days. That hasn't changed. And they then did a second burn to get it to do a close flyby of the moon, 80 miles above, which is close enough for the moon's gravity to put it into what they call a distant retrograde orbit. On the way, it flew over the sites of Apollo 11, 12, and 14, but it's now actually in a very distant orbit around the moon. It's changing all the time, actually, and to be absolutely honest, I couldn't tell you exactly where it is in its orbit at the moment. But basically what happened was the lunar gravity put it into this orbit, which will take it quite far away from the moon, about 40,000 miles, or about 18 and a half lunar diameters away from the moon at its most distant point, what they call apolune. Apo meaning more distant, as in apogee from the Earth. Apolune means most distant from the moon. And that will be actually further away from the moon than any spacecraft capable of carrying human beings has ever been. So it's going to do several orbits around the moon, checking systems, checking the gravity, checking possible landing areas, checking the environment. Those, as I say, are those distant, elongated retrograde orbits. Then it's going to fire the engine again and do a trans-Earth injection. That will take it out of lunar gravity and head it back towards the Earth, where it'll do a splashdown in the Pacific on December the 11th. That's a total mission of 26 days, which is considerably longer than any of the Apollo missions. But they're using that time to test out a whole lot of systems and so on. They have 3 mannequins on board, not humans, but what they call test flight dummies. And they will be monitored for exposure to radiation and all sorts of other things, which will be relevant whenever they actually send humans there. So the systems now are basically at the pre-test stage, like sort of Apollo 8 and so on, although it was a manned flight. But they're working now towards the first human flight to the moon. It won't be a landing, it'll be a fly round, and then an actual landing, which hopefully could be as early as 2025 with Elon Musk's Starship. But there's an awful lot more to do before then, but certainly so far, so good. It was a long delay, but you simply can't risk that amount of money, that amount of material and so on the launch pad and try to fire it off when everything's aren't going right. So, like, I'm sure you were as thrilled as I was to actually see it go up.
Thrilled. I don't know. I mean, the issue is, as you said, the delays. It's the cost. You know, NASA's total budget for each year is around about $19 billion. Between the James Webb's overrun and cost and budget, etc., and now Artemis's cost and overrun, and a lot of that's gone to Boeing as one of the prime subcontractors. Don't forget, Lockheed Martin have had their module, the crew module, ready Orion for quite some time now. That flew several years ago as a test article into low Earth orbit, to medium Earth orbit. Actually, it was quite high apogee on that one. The European ATV, which is now the service module, as was on the Apollo days, which has been modified now to provide the service module capabilities for this. Again, that's been ready for quite some time. Fantastic system, really good solar arrays, generating a lot of power for the crew module, which obviously is significantly bigger than the Apollo crew modules, which were really, really cramped. We'll be going on to that again in a few short minutes when we talk about the kind of backstory, and it is coming up to one of the anniversaries for Apollo. What I find interesting about the mannequins as well is that they're human rating them around the female form, because obviously this is the first time, during the Apollo era, it was all test pilots, it was all people like Gene Cernan, Neil Armstrong, etc., from the various test pilot schools and test pilot groups. This time, obviously, NASA are aiming to basically send what they think is a vastly more representative crew, and it is a vastly more representative crew. We've had incredible female commanders of space stations going back to people like Arlene Collins, Samantha Cristoforetti, etc. So the mannequins on board are actually monitoring based around female physiology, because with a female never having done a deep space mission like this, the ISS is largely protected by the Van Allen belts around the Earth. So the exposure to radiation, depending on what the solar activity is like, and luckily during most of Apollo there wasn't a lot of high solar activity apart from in Apollo 17, where there was a bit of a solar storm at one point. But as you said, Terry, these are longer missions and they're going out much further. So, as Terry said, the crew module is now, its Apolloon is significantly further for any crew-rated vehicle than it's ever been done before. And then you've got the factor, as you said, and you alluded to, Starship. They're not going to be trying to land something like the lunar LEM. If you remember, if any of you have been to the Science Museum in London or been to the Smithsonian in Washington, you'll have seen what the LEM looks like. They've got LTA 8, which is the Lunar Test Article 8 in the Smithsonian. They've got a mock-up in the Science Museum. They look really big, but they're not. They're relatively small. They were designed for 2 people. Obviously, during the Apollo 13 disaster, there were 3 people on board the LEM for quite a considerable amount of time. So it can sustain 3 people, but it was never designed for that. The LEM itself is extremely thin. I mean, the walls on it, in some points, you can literally put a pencil through. I mean, it's really, really thin material. And it was never designed for anything other than, going to the moon, landing on the lunar surface, and hopefully not kicking up a lot of dust. Now, you only have to look at the size of Starship and the amount of regolith that's going to be kicking up. And the fact is that the second mission, if this one is a success, which we all hope it's going to be, second mission in about 2 to 2.5, maybe 3 years' time, that's when they're going to be testing it with a crew on board. Now, it's only going to be akin to an Apollo 8 style mission. They're going to go into lunar orbit. They're going to, do a kind of figure of 8, around the moon, as it were, go into a low lunar orbit, probably drop down to anywhere between 60 to 80 miles above the lunar surface, very similar to Apollo 10. But unlike in Apollo 10, they tested the lander. Because with Apollo 8, they didn't have the lander ready. Apollo 9 was the first time it was ever tested, and that was in low Earth orbit, Spider and Gumdrop, with Dave Scott and Jim McDivitt, etc. Jim sadly passed away quite recently. This is going to be a huge test, because they've got to not only get the lander ready, but how do they test it? The second mission is a lunar orbit mission. Are they going to do a preliminary test on Starship at this point and take it down to so far above the lunar orbit? Or is Starship even capable of doing that? This is the other thing. Starship is being designed by Elon Musk, obviously, for launching very heavy payloads, potentially hundreds or even thousands of Starlinks, which perish the thought, into low Earth orbit and then come back down again and land safely on its pad. We've seen what the Falcon Heavy can do in terms of multiple cores landing in parallel on the pad, but these things are generating an awful lot of thrust when they're doing so. These are not insignificant vehicles. And Starship itself, you've got other logistical issues like where the crew cabin is located relative to setting out on the lunar surface. So all of that has basically got to be tested at least once. They're not going to send a crew to the moon with a completely untested vehicle. If you look at what they've done so far, you look at Apollo 8, that was largely an untested vehicle. And it was it's probably the bravest thing NASA have ever done, because you're only about 18 months after the Apollo 1 fire when they killed 3 of the crew on the pad. And then, because of the space race, as it were, they thought, right, we've got to beat the Russians to the moon. So they sent Apollo 8 with a crew on over Christmas. Had that gone wrong, we'd still be looking at the moon now, watching 3 dead people orbiting around it. Jim Lovell and his crew on Apollo 8 and Bill Anders. It would have been horrible. But it was the kind of risk that they used to take. Now, if they're so risk averse that they haven't even launched this, we had Apollo 4, Apollo 6, etc. Apollo 6 almost shook itself to pieces. So sending up an uncrewed first flight is not unusual. They did it with the space shuttle. They put a crew on the first space shuttle at launch, which again was incredibly risky. But this, I can see where they're coming from. But if their risk aversion continues, then they're going to have to really test Starship in lunar orbit to see if it can land. Now, what are they going to do? Are they going to let Elon Musk launch one on a Falcon Heavy and test it uncrewed, which would be the most sensible thing to do, is to basically send it, but has it got the lift and the thrust capability? Or is it going to require a full stack Starship to take the Starship module that they're intending to land on the lunar surface to the moon attempt a landing, see what the impact is on the lunar regolith, etc. See if it is stable enough, because don't forget, he's landing, precision landings on a flat launch pad in a relatively, it's a relatively known environment. Whereas lunar surface, you only have to look at Apollo 11 and the fact that the guidance computer and everything was saying, we're going to land here, we're going to stick them in the middle of a boulder field. And Neil Armstrong had to do an override that literally at the last minute to basically say, well, we can't land there, we're going to have to move downrange a bit. So there's a lot of factors here. And then the radiation side, as we've seen, Terry, the sun is picking up. And we've been almost a decade now with practically zero activity on the sun's surface, almost no sunspots. Now we're getting some pretty radically large sunspots and some pretty decent solar activity. So that's going to be another interesting constraint on top of all of this. So yes, I am excited. I'm very excited about the first, I'm hoping against hope that because the European Space Agency have been such an integral part of this, that for the first crew going to the moon, it won't just be a NASA crew, that there will be at least one member of the European Space Agency. Given that the service module, NASA can't do anything.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I'd love it to be Samantha Cristoforetti because she's brilliant. She's an iconic astronaut. She's fantastic in terms of the PR. She'd be a brilliant astronaut to be the first female to set foot on the moon. Whether NASA will allow that, or they'll want one of their own NASA astronauts to be the first female on the moon, who knows? But it's exciting times, definitely. The next 2 to 5 years are going to be exciting. The question is, Musk is already working on plans of his own, and we only have to look at what he's done with Twitter to realize that the guy's a megalomaniac and he doesn't care. So if he's got a spacecraft that's ready and he can launch his own Starship and get his own crew to the lunar surface, even before NASA, and I'm not sure what the contractual obligations are there. And then obviously we've got what China are doing as well to keep an eye on. So very, very interesting times.
Interesting comments there. I like Chris's sense of humor. The Italian job thing, I only told you to blow the bloody doors off.
I mean,
and then Dynetics, of course. Yeah, there's a whole lot of pros and cons on that as well.
There is, and it's going to be interesting to see what is going to happen. There's some really great comments, so thank you. Keep those coming in. Hoping Musk does a better job than Twitter. Absolutely, Dynetics, negative mass capability. Yeah, there's some really good. If you're not reading the comments, please do, because there's some really good ones coming in there. Starship on the moon. Yes, it does seem insane, to be honest, but we shall see.
It seems like something out of a Tintin cartoon, when it's sitting there.
It really does, doesn't it? It's like
or Jules Verne.
It's Thunderbirds. It's Thunderbird 1 landing on the moon. So, or Tintin, or Jules Verne thing, but without the whack in the eye. Anyway, moving on. But it's going to be the one to watch. And seeing some of the images coming back from the lunar surface again reminds me of this. So we're very, very close now, and this, I guess, was part of NASA's goal, was to get something back. And obviously the original timeline, they were going to have a crew there by now. The whole, when Trump was in office, he was saying he was going to have a crew on the lunar surface by the time he left office, kind of thing. And, all praise to Trump for his wit and humor. We are approaching the 50th anniversary of the final Apollo flight. Now, this to me was like the pinnacle of space exploration. To many people it was. Apollo is still, until we land on the surface of Mars, even when we land Artemis on the surface of the moon. Don't forget, this was done 50 years ago with the computing power of a Sinclair Spectrum. So we're looking at a 72 kilobyte, or slightly bigger, 72 kilobyte computer running at about 1 and a bit megahertz, controlling the guidance system of a rocket that was initially designed in the early 1960s. It's still the tallest rocket, okay, not the most powerful now ever to launch, but the tallest rocket still ever to launch. So it's still the pinnacle. Until we land on the surface of Mars, Apollo to me is still the greatest technical achievement in human history. And Apollo 17, Gene Cernan, Jack Schmitt, Ron Evans in orbit, etc., was the pinnacle of that exploration. They spent more time on the moon. They drove farther in the rover, the detection of orange soil, putting an actual geologist, a trained scientist, on the lunar surface was the pinnacle. in my humble opinion. It's approaching. It's early December. Is going to be the 50th anniversary of Apollo 17. If anyone's up at the National Space Centre in Leicester, they're having a whole evening of celebrations and talks, and I'm going to be there giving some talks on Apollo, which is one of my favourite subjects in the whole world. But it's really sad now that, I mean, I'm hoping that some of the Apollo guys will still be alive to see the first Artemis astronaut set foot. You know, Charlie Duke's still around with us. Jack's still around from Apollo 17. But we've recently lost Jim McDivitt, as we said in the last show. That number's dwindling really, really quickly. And I just really hope that, you know, someone like Charlie Duke or Jack Schmidt gets to see, you know, the first landing, as it were, since they did it. And it's interesting as well, looking at Artemis, and you're saying about the overflight and the orbital trajectory of it. Again, we're going to be able to get extremely detailed, high-resolution images of the Apollo landing sites. And then there's the whole thing of, as we're now looking at going back to the moon and setting a more permanent basis, and you only have to read Artemis by Andy Weir, the kind of follow-on to the Martian, and his notion of having like lunar bases, as it were, near to the Apollo landing sites, and in some cases named after the Apollo astronauts' Apollo landing sites themselves, to look at the heritage implications. Because if you've got China, for example, who are, you know, equally keen to get astronauts or taikonauts onto the surface of the moon at some point, there's going to have to be almost like an Antarctic agreement for the lunar surface. And you've had idiots for years trying to sell bits of the moon or sell plots on the moon and what have you, you know, like people selling stars. It's all very sweet, very nice, but it means nothing. It's not legit. You can't do this. So we need to have almost like a United Nations treaty agreement in place, which we can't even get for low Earth orbit. We're polluting that at a rate of knots. And only, you know, one of the stories I thought about throwing in this week was this whole crazy idea of putting gigantic solar arrays in low Earth orbit to beam energy down to the Earth. It's like, well, if you're going to trash the night sky, let's do it in style, hey? Because if you've got a massive solar array up there, like, yeah, what's the problem with that, hey? That's not a big target. So Apollo 17, if you've got a chance, it's worth celebrating. It's a phenomenal thing. And if you've not read up, if you're not following like people like Gavin on Twitter, you know, there's some incredible people who've got very, very deep knowledge on the Apollo missions who post on social media. Well worth following. And actually, if you don't know a lot about these missions, they are incredible. They were incredible. So it's great to see that we're finally going back. But to my mind, until we get to Mars, nah.
Yeah. The main problem, Nick, on the moon in terms of finding landing sites is going to be at the South Pole, because only a limited number of places there we get permanent sunlight, and that's where most of the water is. So whoever gets there first are going to stake out the whole of the relevant mountaintop or whatever, that they really need a United Nations body to sort that out. Otherwise, they'll be fighting over where you can land.
Well, that's the thing as well. And the whole kind of one of the key thrusts of this is to provide us with a base, or provide humanity with a base that we can train, as it were, for follow-on missions to Mars. And, you know, some of the questions, how long we have before we have lunar bases? Well, hopefully within 10 years we'll have, you know, if Musk's Starship capability and what Artemis is capable of in terms of, you know, its mass to low Earth orbit and to lunar orbit, you'll be able to assemble something with relatively, you know, some speed. If Starship can land on the lunar surface, the payload that could land with it could be quite significant in terms of developing habitats. And you only have to look at The Martian, again, phenomenal film in many respects, to look at the construction of a habitat and what that could be, almost like a shell, because you don't need the levels of protection. You haven't got wind, you know, weather, etc. on the lunar surface. You've got to protect against radiation as your key killer on the lunar surface. So having something structurally sound and using the lunar regolith as well to provide almost like a coating for the base, or utilizing some of the lava tubes, lava tunnels, you know, places like Hadley Rill, etc., which is just a big collapsed lava tunnel. But there's loads of actual caves and lunar and tunnels on the moon that could provide the basis for some form of protection and shelter. But then it's this whole issue of water and deuterium and all of the things that they're aiming to find and mine to be able to utilize as a resource on the moon to save carrying up water, or to save, you know, water, obviously it's hydrogen and oxygen. You can split it to form fuels. And if you can launch then from lunar orbit onwards to Mars, you know, there could be some benefits and cost savings there. And then the whole, you know, they've even got the same problem that they had with Apollo. When Artemis goes on the far side of the moon, they lose contact. So we don't even have that lunar relay in place yet, which is obviously part of what the Gateway and various other things are going to be doing in the next, hopefully, few years. But yeah, it's good. Rob Thomas in the quote saying, you know, it'd be amazing to imagine what we have, you know, in 50 years. We could be calling the moon home, but I'll caveat emptor that one, Robert, in that 50 years ago, people like Werner von Braun were saying we were going to be living on Mars by the mid-80s, and that was the plan. And it probably would have happened if Nixon, you know, let's talk about corrupt presidents for a second. If Nixon hadn't nixed the whole, you know, Apollo program, you know, because they got cold feet over it and nobody was interested. And this is the other thing. So the public response and the optics to this are going to be really, really important. Because at the moment, the world is in a financial mess. We're in an economic crisis. We've got global warming. We've got climate change. We've got all sorts of issues on the surface of this planet right now. So if we go gallivanting off to the moon and spending trillions of dollars, that's not going to wash in the same way that it didn't wash for a lot of people in America. Once Apollo 11 was done, nobody cared. You know, Apollo 13 was almost like, oh, everyone's interested again because it was danger. Something bad could have happened. Nobody cared about Apollo 14. Very few people watched 15, 16. Some people watched 17 because it was the last one. But this is the thing. It's the public interest. And yes, we've got social media. We've got, you know, but our closed space nerd community is not the wider general public. So this is a key thing. Anyway, moving on.
You have to have the public with you. It's their tax dollars and their tax pounds and euros.
Absolutely.
Get everything up there.
Yeah, Chris is saying China's got a far-side relay. Yeah, again, you're right, Chris. But there's no collaboration still. You know, we're at war with Russia, so that's gone. There's no collaboration with the Russians and Roscosmos, and I can't see that happening for the foreseeable future. We've got China. Obviously, they're in a space race with China, but there's also a commercial space race. So it's going to be really, really interesting. And Robert saying, as I said the other day, nobody wants to pay for big candles in the middle of a climate crisis. That's the problem. It's for that launch, Artemis, beautiful as it was slightly underwhelming because obviously the time of day they launched in the middle of the night, as it were. Very few people got to see it. But it was quite underwhelming. But then you look at it and it's $4 billion. Musk can do it for a tenth of the cost. Hates him, as you know, a lot of people seem to be doing now because of obviously what he's done with Twitter and what have you. But you can't argue with the guy's technical prowess when it comes to rockets. He knows what he's doing when it comes to, SpaceX know what they're doing when it comes to rockets. So, and I've been banging on about going back to the moon for years and wanting to see this. But now that it's finally happening, given the state of the planet, it's a bit of a. Anyway, we've got to move on because we've got loads of stories. Next one. This is, I'll kind of zip through this a bit quicker than I was going to, but future of Mars. So Phobos and Deimos, Mars, really great to see at the moment. I was out a few nights ago at the Marlborough Observatory, Marlborough College Observatory, with an 18-inch refractor, F15 18-inch refractor. This is a beast. This telescope was built in the 1850s. It's had a complete overhaul. It's got full go-to capability. It's incredible. You can become a friend of Marlborough College if you're in the west of England, and it's just amazing. To look at Mars through a massive refractor, it gave me almost Percival Lowell kind of vibes, as it were, and going back to the early days back at the Flagstaff Observatory and what they were doing there. 1877, so Asaph Hall discovered Phobos and Deimos. These are the two moons of Mars. Now, when we think of moons orbiting a planet, we look at Jupiter, and you've got the four primary Galilean moons, all of which, one of which is bigger than Mercury itself. I mean, these are significant bodies. Phobos and Deimos are tiny. So Phobos, which is the larger of the two, is about the same size as the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. We're looking at something around about 13 to 15 miles across, which is really, and Deimos is even smaller. And these things orbit really, really close to the planet relative to, our own moon, which is average orbital distance of 250,000 miles away. These are, tens of thousands of miles away, as it were, or, it's significantly closer. They orbit 3 times a day. Phobos goes around Mars 3 times a day. So it's an 8-hour orbit. Now, the other thing with Phobos is they've now found out that when it was first imaged back in the Viking days, as it were, when some of the orbiters were sent up from the Viking missions, and also more recently we've had Mars Express and Mars, all the various Mars orbiters. There's half a dozen there at the moment orbiting Mars, including ones from Japan, etc. So they've imaged these moons both in transit from the surface with likes of Perseverance and Spirit and Opportunity, but also from orbit. And they notice these stripes, almost like the tiger stripes that we've seen on some of the other moons in the solar system, going out to Enceladus or Europa, etc., where you've got these kind of cracks and fissures forming. The original theory was that Phobos, because there's a large crater on it called Stickney, they thought that it was the result, these stripes, these cracks, was the result of an asteroid impact. Now, Phobos and Deimos are probably captured asteroids anyway, because if you look at Mars and Jupiter basically lie either side of the asteroid belt. So at some point in the deep distant past, probably something was bumped. It probably got put into a Mars captive orbit, but its orbit is decreasing. This is the thing with Phobos. So its orbit is decreasing by around about 2 centimeters a year, 1.5 to 2 centimeters a year. Doesn't sound like much, but in about 40 million years' time, that thing's going to hit the planet's surface. We're not going to be here, but that's going to be a spectacular boom, potentially. The latest research that's come out is that they think that Mars's gravitational field is actually starting to shred Phobos. So until we land on it, we can't confirm absolutely 100%. And Phobos Grunt, which was a Russian mission, a collaborative mission between Russia and the European Space Agency, was due to do this some time ago, but it blew up in low Earth orbit, the Proton rocket. And this is why I was totally against the whole Proton concept for ExoMars. And anyway, by the by, what we now think is that Phobos is kind of like a composite of a rubble pile central core with a kind of more cohesive mantle area coated in dust on top of this. And what they think Mars's gravitational field is doing is literally pulling this apart, starting to shred it and create these cracks, which are then infilling with dust and creating these kind of lines, which you can see on some parts of Phobos. Whether or not this is true, as I said, the Japanese Space Agency are launching a mission called MMX, which is going to be hopefully landing on Phobos, doing some sampling, bring sample returns back, which would be amazing. And that was obviously the plan with Phobos Grunt, more difficult to land on Mars than it is on one of the moons of Mars. So that was the original plan. This fall rate is going to be interesting, as somebody, I think, Chris has said in the chat, is Phobos a planetary ring in waiting? Yes, it is, because at some point Mars's gravity is going to tear it apart. It's going to tear Phobos apart, and you're going to get something akin to the ring system that we've got around Saturn, which again they believe is an object or objects that have been torn apart, and we're just in a very lucky time in history that we get to see the ring system of Saturn before it kind of gets itself sucked into the planet's surface and or torn apart. I found this really, really fascinating, Terry. I don't know what you think about, have you ever looked at Phobos and Deimos through a telescope?
No, I can't get them. They're you need exceptionally high image quality and just the right conditions. With Mars being so bright, you really need an occulting bar to hide the image of Mars and then try and see Phobos and Deimos. I've never tried it. I'd love to have to go with your 18-inch refractor at Marlborough there. That'd be some doing. I'm sure it's possible with a telescope of that size. Just one thing about Phobos, just to try and give you a picture of it. It's actually orbiting above Mars at a height of 3,700 miles. That's less than a Martian diameter. Yeah. So that's a totally different scenario to the Earth-Moon system. Yeah. And you can just imagine the stresses that is actually causing on it. It is only, I think, inevitable that it's going to break up. It will not still be one solid body by the time it hits the surface of Mars. It'll be broken up to a greater or lesser extent. And some of it will probably remain in the form of a planetary ring. But as you say, we'll not be around to see that.
It's interesting.
Who knows, though,
Yeah, who knows? It could get bumped. But that's the thing. You only have to look at the Galilean moons and Io in particular. It's the same thing that's happening with Io. Io is basically, if you think of an accordion, Io is basically like Jupiter's accordion. It's doing that with it, and that's why you've got such a high level of volcanism on the surface of Io, detected by the Voyager scientists and an intern pretty much at NASA's JPL doing image processing back in the late 70s, early 80s, and seeing for the first time this kind of lump on the side of Io and thinking, what's that? They thought it was an image artifact, or they thought there was another moon behind it initially, and then it's a volcanic object. So it's quite interesting, and the recent detection of subsurface magmatic chambers and what's happening on the Mars surface, as you said, it's totally different dynamics, because our moon gives us our tides, etc., and we do have a kind of real tug of war happening with the moon, even though it's significantly smaller than the Earth. It's going to be interesting to see what Phobos is really doing, even if it's minuscule, because of the proximity. It's got it's a weak gravitational field, but there's something going to be happening between them. And I'm just wondering now if ongoing research can demonstrate that the tidal interaction between Phobos and the Martian surface is possibly creating almost like this slushing beneath the surface. I don't even know if the gravitational field is that strong, but yeah, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And then the other story from Mars is Perseverance. So all this is happening in orbit, and we're observing from the ground here and looking at Phobos and Deimos, etc. As Terry said, using a Colting bar, it's quite easy to image actually if you've got a half decent sized telescope. But Perseverance, which is trundling its way through Jezero Crater, has come across this sandstone region. Now, why is that important? Well, these sandstone regions, it's in a river delta. And what they've found is, from analogies with Earth-based river deltas, is that you get kind of fluvial outflow, you get the organic material, you get all sorts of stuff dragged down in these deltas. So if there is any chance at all of finding prehistoric life, or the evidence for life, or organic material of some form, these are the kind of hotspots that you're looking at, because the water, if you imagine, in Mars's deep dark past, it was covered in water, so we believe, and there was river deltas. If you've got organic material or any form of life, even microbial, it would have been dragged down in mud, for example, and that mud would have then solidified, and given the right technical capabilities and equipment. And there's a big argument right now with Artemis, going back to the Artemis story, as to whether or not it is going to be necessary to send humans on these missions, because AI is becoming so advanced, robotics is becoming so advanced, the rovers are generating incredible amounts of data. So the argument is, well, do we need astronauts at all? Because it's so risky, the radiation hazard, the duration of the mission, the stresses on the mental health, etc. But to get boots on the ground in Jezero Crater, or one of these regions where you've got methane hotspots, for example, I'm really passionate about that. But to get a geologist with a microscope, a scanning electron microscope, on the Mars surface, near where these sandstone runoffs are being found, and to go through the clays and say, yeah, look at that, there's evidence of microbial life in here. That's going to blow the doors open, to go back to the quotes in the Italian Joel quote. It's going to blow the doors off. The whole thing, in terms of the implications we were saying a few weeks ago, the implications for religion and all sorts of stuff there. But yeah, it's fascinating what Perseverance is almost forgotten about. And I remember sitting up and waiting for that thing to land and thinking, wow, this is incredible, with the sky crane. And second time that they'd done it, it was a remarkable landing. But all the rovers on the Mars surface have been incredible. But this one's just kind of carefully trundling through. It's picking up, caching these rocks. It's now going to become the way to get them back to the MAV and take it back off the Mars surface, bring them back to the Earth. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Terry, but this hunt for life, I think we're at a really interesting time. We're talking about Artemis and how interesting that is, but Mars exploration is really starting to ramp up now.
Yeah, absolutely. It tended to be very much in the background after InSight and the helicopter flights and so on. Yep. But yeah, it has been doing and is still doing amazing science. And the two of them, between them, working together, different areas, are revolutionizing our knowledge of Mars. And yeah, it's absolutely essential. If we're ever going to send humans there, we need to have this sort of information about, first of all, what the surface is like, and secondly, where's the best place to go and actually have humans searching closely for signs of life or any other things of interest that may be there. But the search for life is probably the primary one.
And the thing, going back to the China discussion that we had before, don't forget China, one for one, they got an orbiter, a lander, and a rover on the surface first go. So if, and it's fantastic looking at some of the recent, global geopolitical conferences where President Biden was talking to Xi Jinping and saying, look, yeah, we've got our differences, but we can't let things escalate to the state of nuclear war and what have you. I would love to see some real, as we saw in The Martian, the movie, the fictional, assistance between what the Chinese Space Agency and NASA and European Space Agency. Could you imagine what they could do, given, like I said, the success of China? You can't argue with how brilliant both their lunar exploration and their Mars exploration. And to be able to land, potential life-hunting AI intelligent robots with scanning electron microscopes, all the proper spectroscopy equipment, etc., to go drilling, looking all over the Martian surface before we send humans there. Before Musk destroys it by sending 2,000 hippies on a starship on a one-way mission to hell. It would be fantastic to see this happen, but I just wish politics would, science, politics, just don't let the two come together.
I have this vision of a sort of a Woodstock event on Mars, with all Elon Musk hippies.
It's going to be more like Burning Man than Woodstock. If Musk doesn't get that landing right, it's going to be like Burning Man. Yeah. Or where's the Tesla? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, imagine. Yeah, all the recalls on those at the moment. But there we go. Yeah. Anyway, onwards to the next story.
Yeah, our good friend, the James Webb Space Telescope, does it again. There's an awful lot that we know about star formation, but there's also an awful lot that we don't know. And what it has done now is give us a lot of information about the very early stages, what we call the protostar. Well, there's something there, but it's not yet shining as a star. And the reason it can do this is, as we've said many times before, because it has this tremendous capability of observing in the infrared, which allows us to see through clouds of gas and dust that are totally obscuring in terms of seeing what's inside them for any telescope on Earth and even for the Hubble Space Telescope. So what we have got there is a wide field view, but if we can zoom in, or if you can just see in the middle of it, a little dark horizontal disk in the middle of the hourglass. And that is what we call a protostellar disk. And you can certainly take photographs with Vista or the VLT or the Hubble and see a disk like that, but you can't see really inside it the way we're now seeing now. So what we've got there, that disk is about the diameter of our solar system, that little dark disk in the middle. We're not going to say too much about the lobes of gas and dust on either side of it, that sort of peripheral. But this is in a dark cloud in the Taurus star forming region, which is one of the relatively close ones to us, only about 430 light years away. And what we've got there is the confirmation, basically, of what were astronomers' theoretical ideas of how stars form. So let's go back to the beginning. They think they're formed, the later generations of stars anyway, from huge clouds of gas and dust. A lot of that has come from material blasted out from supernova explosions from previous stars, which is why it contains other elements other than just hydrogen. And that those big clouds of gas and dust have condensations in them, and they act as a sort of a gravitational well, and they pull more material in on top of them. And the bigger they get, the more material they can pull in. And what happens is, because of sort of random motion, eventually the material towards the center of that starts to spin and forms a disk. And as the material falls in on the disk, it's adding more and more material. It's adding kinetic energy. In other words, when the material hits the disk, it adds heat. As the amount of material increases, then the pressure inside builds up. And eventually, there's enough heat and enough pressure for hydrogen to start forming into helium. That then is when a star begins to shine. Those are the nuclear reactions, and it's then a star. So what we're looking at here is the stage before that. Now, the light that we're seeing there from that object is not from nuclear reactions, because they haven't started yet. It's literally the light shining from the material falling onto the accretion disk and shock waves and so on, which I'm not going to go into. So could we possibly zoom in on the main image again, just to have a look at that? Yeah. So the little dark horizontal disk there is where the material is falling in it hasn't actually started to illuminate yet. The dark areas, or the bright areas on either side of that, is where the light is escaping. And as I say, that is light coming from the impact of the infalling material, not from the actual nuclear reactions which haven't started yet. They reckon that the material that's there in the object in the center of that is only about between 20 and 40% of the mass of our sun. So it's still accumulating material and will do so considerably more when it gets up to somewhere near the mass of the sun. Then there'll be enough temperature, enough pressure in the center for those nuclear reactions to start. So this is absolutely amazing stuff. This was the theory that astronomers had. We couldn't actually see it until now. But with James Webb having this ability to peer through the dust and gas in the infrared, that is showing what we can actually see. The disk there is actually just, as I say, about the diameter of our solar system at the moment. So that gives you an idea of the scale. And stars, as I say, don't form instantaneously. It'll probably be maybe another 50,000, maybe another 100,000 years before there's enough material there and the temperature and pressure are high enough for the nuclear reactions to start. But it does confirm what we have been told by the theoretical astronomers for a long time. That is the way stars are forming. And in that disk, there will be local condensations, which will almost certainly form into planets in the system. Once the star starts to shine, it will blow away a lot of the gas in the what's left of the disk, and the rest will be forming into planets, something like our solar system. As we've seen when we've looked at exoplanet systems, they're all different, but basically they all have planets orbiting more or less in the same plane because they formed out of the disk of material that was falling into the protostar. And just to mention about those lobes, which are the most impressive part visually, that's material that has been forced out, if you like, squeezed out from the center by the material falling in on the disk. And the bluest part there of that you can see in the bottom is where the gas is relatively thin, and the orange part is where it's thicker, and that's how it shows up in the infrared. So it's amazing to see the theory actually being confirmed there, and you are literally looking there at the birth of a star. Amazing stuff. Your view, Nick?
It is, and what's really fascinating, and this again would be phenomenal, I think, follow-on research. You mentioned, the material above and below the main region, as it were, where the planetary formation, stellar formation's occurring. If you were to look around other recently formed star systems, you look at the things like the Pleiades, etc., which are very, very new star systems. But again, using James Webb's capability, being able to look at these plumes, as it were, of almost like ejected material, and look at the analysis of dispersion on that. What's that going to form? Is it cold gas and dust that eventually kind of itself condenses to form what we've now got in our own solar system, being the Oort cloud? So if you look at all of that gas and dust material that's basically being blown away to several tens of light years distance in the case of this, but potentially in other stellar formation systems, what's happening to the remnant gas and dust? And we know that with our own solar system, we've got the Kuiper Belt, we've got the Oort cloud, we potentially have trillions of comets. The Herschel Observatory, which is like the forerunner to James Webb, again, a massive infrared telescope, mirror similar size to the Hubble, so resolution capability nowhere near this, but that was able to image other star systems that had these known water ice rings orbiting around them at around about 1 to 3 light years, similar to what we believe is in the Oort cloud. So I'm really fascinated to know what happens to all the residual dust and material that's left over. As you said, in the main accretion area, this central black line, it looks relatively tiny there, but as you said, Terry, that's about the size of our solar system. And then you've got these knots and condensations within that. Once the star kicks in, as you said, you're going to get a shock wave, which is going to blow the dust out, which is why we believe we've got gas giants at the outer part of the solar system, as opposed to the rocky planets on the inner part of the solar system. But then there's the whole issue of the orbital dynamics and what's happening with these knots. They're not in stable orbits. We know that because of some of the theories now with Jupiter's orbit basically being completely erratic in the early part of the solar system, almost drifting into the inner solar system, potentially in doing so, dragging in tons of material. Could have been water ice, could have been all sorts of things from comets, from meteorites, asteroids, all the stuff that peppered the moon 4.5 billion years ago. Obviously peppered the Earth, gave us our water. Because don't forget, when a planet's forming, it's not going to be forming with a lot of water on it. It's going to be a really hot, dense, volcanic surface for a long time, and then you're going to get stabilization. You're going to get a cool down. Then you're going to get magnetic field forming. You're going to get the ability of that magnetic field to deflect the nearby star's radiation sufficiently to build up an atmosphere. Which Mars has had its atmosphere stripped because it doesn't really have a magnetic field. So there's so much from this image that it just throws so many questions. I absolutely love it. It looks like the Butterfly Nebula, which is another beautiful object I've been lucky enough to image in the past. But it's amazing to see stuff like this, and again, it's showing the James Webb's astonishing capability. And my biggest regret, and talking to people at Goddard, I was over at Goddard when it was being built. My only regret is that they didn't think about a refueling capability or a re-cryo fueling capability for James Webb, because once that cryo runs out, it's dead. It's a big fossil in Lagrange too. If they'd have thought this one through and they'd have had the, especially now with the service capability of the likes of Musk, etc., been able to fly out to it and basically give it a top up of cryo to get it to cool down again. This is an incredible instrument, and yes, they could do another one, but $8 billion is anyone going to swallow that? That's the thing. It almost got cancelled on multiple occasions, the James Webb. Thankfully, it never did. So the fuel, Robert's saying in the question, they're estimating, because the orbital insertion was so good and the whole transfer to L2 was so good, it could exceed its initial life expectancy, which is about 10 years or so. So it could be 15 years, could be a bit longer. You only have to look at how brilliant NASA are in terms of getting things to last longer than they should. I mean, you look at the rovers, Spirit and Opportunity. If we get a month or 9 months, we'll be lucky. 10 years later, still going. Voyager 1, Voyager 2, Voyager 2 in particular, we're looking at 1977 technology that's still sending back valid data and still posing questions. So nominal mission length, which is what they always like to say, and this is the other thing, it's already been struck by micrometeorites. The mirror's been struck already within a few weeks of kind of unfurling. So barring any significant accidents, barring any problem with the reaction engines, the gyros, everything else that can go wrong, because don't forget, the Hubble at 450 miles above the Earth's surface is again largely protected by the radiation shield that keeps us alive around the Earth. It's dipping in and out. It's high enough that it's away far enough, but it's not so high that it's not completely out in interstellar, or not interstellar, in like deep space, as it were. James Webb's being absolutely hammered by cosmic radiation, significant amounts of radiation all the time. And yes, they've got gold beryllium mirrors, etc. It's been designed to be resilient, but nominally, hopefully 10 years. If it lasts any longer, it's going to be a massive bonus. But it's taken 10 years to build and get that one where it is. So whether or not NASA would have the time, money, inclination, or if they're just going to think, hold on, let's stick a big telescope on the far side of the moon.
Yeah. There's one thing they've done to try and minimize the effect of the micrometeorite impacts. They've turned it so that the impact velocity of most of the little objects hitting it will be minimized. It's not quite as simple as this, but basically, except for special events, it'll be flying backwards so that any objects hitting it will be hitting the backside of the mirror. So they come from all directions, but the majority of them now will be ones that will be hitting the backside of the mirror. Some will still hit the front, but because the velocity will be reduced, then the impact energy is reduced considerably. So hopefully that will reduce the amount of damage that's done.
It will be a reduction, but you can only have to go back to 1997, Terry, with Hale-Bopp, and look at the orbital inclination of that. That was almost like a vertical inclination through the solar system, which is why we saw it for so long. So who knows? It's fingers crossed. It always is. It is with space now, full stop. I mean, low Earth orbit is a cosmic shooting gallery right now. I wouldn't want to do anything in LEO right now, especially not launching gigantic solar arrays or big hotels or anything like that. But out at L2, obviously, is a lot less happening, but you don't need much. You only need one object the size of a marble to basically wipe out the James Webb.
Yeah.
So micrometeorites, we're talking about sub-grain of dust kind of size, causing damage to the mirrors already. So, yeah, interesting. Anyway, cracking on that. I love there's so much in that one image that you go, oh, just give me more, give me more. On to our final story. And we're doing okay for time, actually, considering it was a big old rant at the beginning. Spaceport Cornwall. Yeah, I see what you mean. So we were talking about their logo, and it's kind of like, so this is a big shed. So they're calling it a spaceport. It's not the VAB, let's be honest. I mean, the VAB, the Vehicle Assembly Building, the Cape, is still the largest single-story structure on the planet, pretty much, with the tallest doors. I mean, this is an assembly and integration facility for essentially a quite dull to watch launch. People are getting very excited about the fact that the UK is finally going to launch a sovereign satellite, forgetting the fact that we did one from Woomera in Australia like 50 odd years ago, and then the Wilson government cancelled the whole thing, or somebody cancelled the whole thing anyway. The UK's got the distinguished honour of being one of the only countries in the world that's cancelled its entire space program more than once. Spaceport Cornwall is one of the multiple potential launch sites, and it looks like it's going to get there first. That is that they finally, and again, this is British bureaucracy for you at its very best, got a civil aviation authority license. So the CAA are the people that basically say, yes, you can take off, you can fly over British airspace, yada, yada, yada. The fact that this thing's going to take off from the coast of Cornwall, from Newquay, which is a very remote airport anyway, fly directly out over non-British territorial waters, south coast of Ireland, over the Atlantic. It's going to basically drop a rocket mid-Atlantic. All the range vectors, are going to have to be calculated really carefully, because with a standard static vertical launch from a launch pad, you know exactly what the range trajectory vector is going to be. So when it launches, it goes up in an arc, and you know what's underneath that arc. So if anything were to go catastrophically wrong, anything underneath that arc, and you only have to ask the Chinese about this because they've got it wrong on multiple occasions and crashed rockets into houses and villages and all sorts. But essentially, over the mid-Atlantic, unless you're unlucky enough to be in a cruise ship or a fishing vessel that hasn't really been monitored, it's a relatively safe launch. But they are changing their vector all the time, because they're going to have a nominal drop site. But then if the weather conditions, the wind speeds, whatever, aren't exactly right at that point, they may deviate. And if they deviate by even a few miles, that whole range vector calculation goes out the window. But essentially, what they're going to do, Cosmic Girl, which is a modified 747, British Royal Air Force pilots. There's no military involvement, honest, in this, which is another thing that kind of boils my blood a little bit. It's like, yes, they're going on, and there's some great people at Cornwall. I mean, a massive hat tip to people like Heidi Tiemann. Absolutely brilliant. They've got some great people who are doing really good stuff. But the optics on this, the public perception of this, again, is going to have to be really, really carefully done. Because the people in Cornwall, looking at the comments on this story on various news sites, aren't overly impressed with it. And there's been a lot of outreach work done by Heidi and Melissa and various other people at Cornwall. Really great work. They are passionate about what they're doing. But if they get this wrong, given that the UK is in a massive economic slump right now, we've got inflation soaring at over 10%. We've got mortgage rates going up at phenomenal rates. To see people gallivanting around, and especially because this has got like almost 30% military launches going off on it, they're going to have to be really careful how they do the PR. But they've got their Civil Aviation Authority license. So within the next few weeks, we could see a launch out of Cornwall. Now, I say it's very dull because it is. Essentially, if you're going to see a launch, if you go to NASA, to the Cape, and you're lucky enough to be at Artemis, you would have felt the biggest rocket in 50 years literally shake your chest apart, even at 3 miles away. This is, Artemis is a big beast. This is going to be like going down to the airport and looking at a plane taking off. That's all it is. It's a 747 taking off. 747 with a rocket, a missile underneath one of the wings. As soon as it flies off from the runway, within about 30 seconds, you're not going to see anything. You're not going to see a thing. You could watch it on YouTube. You can watch it on telly. You're going to get exactly the same experience. So unlike, say, Machrihanish or some of the sites up in Scotland, which are vertical launch sites where you will be able to see something, they're going to have perimeters around these sites because, again, a lot of these sites are former defence sites, and you've got companies like Lockheed Martin, various others, heavily involved in the Scottish launch sites. And the interesting thing, again, is that if Scotland devolves, Spaceport Cornwall is going to be the only UK or the only British launch site, because Scotland will be a completely separate entity. So that's going to be another interesting thing, and how the UK Space Agency handle that. You've also got Llanbedr in Wales, which is probably going to be more used for balloons, because again, the range trajectory from that for vertical launch is a nightmare. If you got it wrong there, you're either heading directly over central part of England, you're heading over Northern Ireland, right over you, Terry, or heading up over Scotland. The thing with the Scottish sites, with Shetland and Unst and Machrihanish, etc., they're all going over the North Sea into, yes, it is relatively congested airspace, because it's a lot of the transatlantic traffic coming in from America. Basically, if you know how the transatlantic flights work in the UK, they'll take off from, say, London Heathrow or Manchester or whatever. They'll fly north, basically over Scotland, and do an arc, because it's not a direct route to New York. It's kind of a nice arc that goes over Iceland, Greenland, etc., and kind of brings you down. So that airspace is quite congested. So it's going to be interesting to see how long the Civil Aviation Authority, who've been over a year getting a license for Cornwall, and Cornwall, to my mind, is the safest of all the launches, and probably the safest bet in terms of all the launches. Because the environmental impact is quite minimal. You only have to look at, there's issues. There's been legal actions and lawsuits against some of the sites in Scotland with, decimation of peat bogs and peat being a big carbon sink, etc. So it's, as I said, they're going to have to handle this really, really, really carefully, and also find maybe a more interesting logo. That logo is very confusing, but they are a great team, and like I said, my hat really does tip to Heidi and Melissa and various other people. My company were involved a long time ago in some of the original concepts with this, and talking to them, because we do a lot of range safety work and fuel safety work, etc., for the Ministry of Defence. So we'll probably be involved at some point, or doing something for one of the sites. But it's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting, and it will be something for Cornwall to be proud of. But as I said, looking on some of the groups and the posts against this, I haven't seen a single positive one yet. There's been a lot of positive outreach for schools and STEM engagement, etc., from the Spaceport Cornwall team, but the public reaction to this so far, mixed. I don't know what your thoughts are, Terry, but that's what I've seen.
I think it's actually stretching it to say that the rocket will be launched from UK. You don't want to pour cold water on it, but that 747 could, in theory, take off from any suitable runway anywhere in the world and launch it. And looking at it from the other point of view, when you see that thing taking off, okay, there's something under the wing, but apart from that, the 747 might as well be carrying 20 tons of coconuts. It's just a launch, But yeah, it's good to have something there. And as far as that logo is concerned, I just wonder why one of the quadrants seems to have dropped down from the top of the building. I'm sure there's a good reason for it. But I can't quite work it out. Maybe from somebody from Spaceport will let us know, post something on it. And maybe it's highly significant. Anyway, as you say, the PR angle is going to be crucial on this. You need to get the public behind you. There'll be people that will go along and watch the takeoff just out of interest. Even seeing a 747 takeoff, if you can get relatively close to it, is quite spectacular and noisy. But if they get the PR right, and if Branson is prepared to use the facility often enough, it will be a viable economic proposition.
But this is the thing. This is the problem. You only have to look at Virgin Galactic. That's gone very quiet as well. The initial hype, Branson was on the flight, lots of hype. Obviously, they had some of the issues. Human space-rated launches potentially could be done. Cosmic Girl, the runways aren't big enough for some of the potential launches. But it's interesting. Look at some of the comments. The FAA, the US Federal Aviation Authority, they had to have someone seconded. And don't forget, 90% of this, they say it's a British launch. The aircraft is American. The company, Virgin Orbit, are American. They're not a British, Richard Branson's the big cheese, as it were. But this is a US company. A lot of the money coming into this is from the US. The refueling system is a US refueling system. The rocket is an American rocket. Yes, the satellites, including Space Forge, the first Welsh satellite, they are British. But as you said, Terry, these are CubeSats. These could be carried in a Pelican case on a transatlantic flight for 300 quid to New York and launch from anywhere in the US. So there's a lot of PR in this and a lot of spin, and the economics, talking to people at Machrihanish and talking to the Shetland teams and what have you, SpaceX has redefined what a launch cost should be completely. It's so cheap compared to anything else that's out there. And this is expensive. This is like, you've got to get the aircraft over, the logistics over, the refueling system over. This is not the cheapest option in terms of launching, into space. And I know Skyroar have had recent problems with their suborbital flight, and they're still saying they're going to go orbital by next year. And there's all sorts of plans to go orbital by next year. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
Right. Okay. We're running short of time. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, we are pretty much. Just then, very briefly, and look up. Our good friend, the International Space Station, is now, it's just commenced another series of evening passes. There are any number of apps for your smartphone or websites where you can look up where it's going to be passing over your particular area. Mars, we'll be talking more about it. It's heading close to Earth now for its opposition when it's closer to Earth in early December. Jupiter, also very bright, the brightest star-like object in the sky. Not quite as bright as the moon, obviously, but in terms of objects that look like stars, you can't miss it. But the interesting thing coming up is that on December the 5th, at round about 5 p.m. in the evening, depending on where you are in the UK, the moon will actually occult Uranus. It will pass in front of Uranus. And again, you will need a website to find out just exactly where that's going to be, unless you start looking, say, about half an hour beforehand. You identify Uranus, which is slightly greenish-coloured disk. Use a bit of magnification, and you'll see that it's not a star. And then you simply watch the moon encroaching on it. And then over a matter of just a few seconds, the moon's disk will pass in front of and cover Mars. It'll be almost a full moon, not quite. So there's just a bit of a dark part of the moon, the unilluminated part of the moon as we see it, which will pass across Mars, and then it'll be gone. And now to try and see it coming out on the other side will be round about an hour later. Very difficult to see because that will be the bright side of the moon. But you can either just watch the event happening or go online and find out exactly when it will happen from your particular location.
Is it Mars, Terry, or Uranus? Because you said Uranus.
Yeah. It will be, I've meant to say that actually. It'll be Mars on December the 8th, which is after our next one. And we'll be talking about that. Sorry, on this occasion, it's Uranus. I just saw Mars there in the screen.
It's going to be amazing, both.
Sorry. Just by coincidence, it will be occulting the two planets within about 4 days of each other. Sorry about that, Nick. Thanks for getting that.
No, Uranus is amazing as well in that you only need a pair of binoculars to see it. It's very difficult with the naked eye unless you're Stephen O'Meara and you're hyperventilating on oxygen on the top of a mountain because it's magnitude 6-ish. But you can just about see it with a good pair of binoculars. And as Terry said, you can't miss it. You point a telescope at it, you can't miss it. It's a green disc. It looks very, very different to any stars in the same field. So well worth looking at if you've never seen Uranus. Mars as well.
It's a nice time of the evening. The Mars one is at about 5 o'clock in the morning. This one's 5 p.m. Very respectable time.
But Mars was going back to the observatory at Marlborough. Looking at Mars, if you get a chance to go to a local astronomical society, or you're thinking of presents for your kids for Christmas and you're going to get them a good sized telescope or a good sized pair of binoculars, Mars is amazing to look at. Looking at it the other night, you could see the polar caps so clearly. And we only had very brief because the clouds, it wasn't optimal, but you could see the polar caps. You could see Syrtis Major, this dark kind of region that looks like a V shape on Mars so clearly. And it's one of those wonderful things, especially if you get into astrophotography and imaging. You can image a volcano on the surface of another planet from here, from anywhere on the Earth's surface. So well worth looking at in terms of lookup. Thank you so much to Chris, Ground-Based Space, so many people, Robert, people. Jared. In the chat for some really great comments, really great questions. Yes, I'm looking forward to Dream Chaser. I talked to Buzz Aldrin about that many years ago because he was a big fan of Dream Chaser. That's the kind of mini X-37B shuttle copy, as it were. That's going to be really interesting to look out for. Back over to our amazing friends at Space Store. Pop over to Space Store in Oxford. It's a great place. Really, really loads of fun. They do great stuff at Didcot and the Oxford store. But back to you, Abby.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such a great show. And thank you, to everyone who's getting involved in the comments. It's always good to hear from people. A quick note from Space Store. We've got our festive menu starting in Didcot at the start of December this week. So come down if you're in Didcot, come and check that out. And our next show will be the 6th of December, so that's in 2 weeks' time. So join us again then, and in the meantime, please follow us on our socials and come down to Space Store if you get an opportunity. Lots of fun things going on. Thank you again to Nick and Terry for a great show.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Lex.
Adios.
Bye. Cheers, everybody.
Bye.
Hi, my name's Nick Howes, space enthusiast, author, writer, broadcaster.
Hi, I'm Terry Mosley, past president of the Irish Astronomical Association, lifelong astronomy and space nerd, absolutely fascinated by everything, both man-made and natural up there.
So every 2 weeks, Terry and I give you the latest, hottest news from space and human spaceflight, robotic spaceflight, and what's happening up in the skies. Please tune in to us every fortnight with the Space Store.
Adios, amigos.
Bye, all.